all the way my Savior leads me. Cheers each winding path I tread, gives me grace for every trial, feeds me with the living bread.
Good morning, Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. 1 Samuel chapter 21, beginning in verse 10. David flees to Gath, which is Philistine territory. Interesting story. One of those stories where David just makes a really weird and kind of boneheaded decision, just like we saw in the previous story with reference to the bread of the presence. Here we go. David flees to Gath. And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see this man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I like madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" David flees from the land of Israel into the land of Achish, the king of Gath, into the land of Gath. And as he flees and crosses over into Gath, he leaves the land of blessed protection and goes into the territory of the Philistines. He is immediately recognized by Achish's men, and they say, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Is this not the one about whom they have sung, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s? David hears these words. He knows that he's been recognized. He knows he's in danger, and so he is afraid. He's afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. He's afraid that Achish is going to have him killed. So David's answer to the problem is to act like a madman, to act like an insane person. Makes marks on the doors of the gate, let spittle run down his beard. Achish says to his servants, "Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I like madmen, that you've brought this madman into my presence? Shall he come into my house?" And so Achish basically pushes David away, and David survives as a result of acting like a madman. Now, in one sense, you look at this and you say, "Man, David, that's pretty creative." Right, you do what you need to do to survive. In another sense, the whole situation is created by David's decision to leave the land of promise to go into the land of his enemies. Now, Saul is chasing him in Israel, but God's hand is upon David. David, being a man after God's own heart, should know that God will protect him, that God will preserve him. David should know that God is the one who will keep him. But David, like all of us, gets afraid. David, like all of us, looks to the short term. And as such, he flees into the land of Gath to get away from Saul and his men. He fled from the place of God's divine protection into a land that is not a place of God's divine protection, into the land of his enemies, into the home of the enemies of God's people. Now, God is gracious and God protects him, and God's protection is not bound by geographical border. God can protect him in Gath just like he can protect him in Israel. But what we see is here in his fear, he runs and flees rather than staying put and standing firm and trusting the Lord where he is. Not to mix Bible stories too much, but you see the exact same thing at the beginning of the book of Ruth. Elimelech and his family, his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, leave Bethlehem, which is the Hebrew word for house of bread. They leave the house of bread in the midst of a famine to go to the land of Moab. They go from the place where God has promised to provide provision for his people into a land that God has promised to judge. They flee the land of provision to go into a land of want, a land of hunger, a land of famine. And they flee. In that moment, they find food, but tragic things happen to them while they're in the land of Moab. I think the lesson for us here is we need to learn, right, to trust the Lord to walk with him and to trust him where he has us. If he has got his hands upon us where we are, he will protect us. Unless he specifically tells us to move, we need to stay where we are. We need to trust him. We need to rest in him, recognizing in his providence and his sovereignty that the trials and the tribulations in our lives are necessary for the accomplishment of his will for us, his good and glorious will, and trust him that all things will be accomplished according to that will and for the good of his people. And so David should have recognized that. We should recognize that. Elimelech and Naomi should have recognized that. May we trust the Lord and learn to trust him as we follow him both now and every day. You guys take care. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.
You carry